Life during the Great Depression tested every family's creativity in the kitchen. With wages scarce and grocery budgets even tighter, they somehow managed to turn the most basic ingredients into hearty meals. In today's video, we're unveiling 20 cheap dinners that helped countless households survive. And decades later, these thrifty dishes still offer comforting inspiration. Number 1, grits and greens. During the 1930s, rural families who lacked easy access to wheat-based products often turned to corn grits. Cooking them slowly in water until creamy provided a cheap base, and any type of garden greens, spinach, collard leaves, or even dandelion tops would be stirred in to add flavor. Some households collected bacon drippings for a salty kick, but many skipped meat entirely due to cost. Grits were sold in large sacks that lasted for weeks, making this dish a mainstay at dinner time. By the 1940s, baby boomers in the South grew up on versions of this hearty meal. In the 1970s, nostalgia for soul food rekindled interest in Depression-era grits, reminding families of how something so humble could warm both stomach and spirit. Number 2, salmon rice loaf. Canned salmon was an economical protein source when fresh fish was out of reach. Families combined it with rice, often leftover from the previous day, plus a little onion and breadcrumbs if they had any. This loaf baked up firm yet moist, slicing easily to serve large families on a tight budget. Oral histories from the 1930s document how communities along the East Coast thrived on pantry staples like salmon and rice, with local church gatherings featuring salmon rice loaves as competition entries. By the 1950s, some baby boomers remembered these loaves as the fish meatloaf of their childhoods. In the 1970s, resurging interest in budget cooking brought the recipe back, especially for families looking to replicate old America's thrifty traditions. Number 3, eggless custard pudding. When eggs and fresh milk were pricey, a faux custard emerged. Cooked cornstarch, sugar, and watered-down evaporated milk formed a pudding-like texture that kids adored. Mothers improvised flavor using nutmeg or cocoa powder, creating a comforting dessert from near-empty pantries. Diaries from the 1930s mention how popular this became during winter months in rural regions, where traveling to buy eggs wasn't always possible. Later, in the 1940s, women's magazines picked up the recipe as an economical treat. Many baby boomers recall grandmothers whipping up custard without cracking a single egg. By the 1970s, this recipe popped up in retro-themed cookbooks, celebrating a golden age of resilience, proving that sweet satisfaction didn't require expensive ingredients. Number 4, potato and onion frittata. This dish emerged in communities with strong European roots, adapting the traditional frittata to Depression constraints. Families often replaced expensive eggs with a smaller quantity, stretching them using chopped potatoes and onions that had been pre-cooked in minimal fat. The result was a hearty skillet meal that could feed a crowd from just a few eggs. In the 1930s, some Italian-American neighborhoods called it poor man's frittata, though the taste was still comforting and filling. By the 1950s, baby boomers born to immigrant parents often recognized this staple from Sunday brunch tables. In the 1960s and 1970s, it reappeared in budget-focused TV segments, with hosts stressing that onions and potatoes could be found cheaply year-round. Number 5, hominy stew. Hominy, made by soaking corn kernels in an alkaline solution, was a lifesaver for families in parts of the rural South and Southwest. Combined with tomatoes, peppers, and sometimes a spoonful of chili powder, hominy stew provided warmth and substance. Oral histories from 1932 in New Mexico mention how a single bag of dried hominy could last all winter, as it expanded significantly when cooked. Families mixed in wild onions or any garden vegetable to create variety. By the 1950s, baby boomers in border states remembered hominy stew fondly, especially when served with tortillas. Then, in the 1970s, regional cookbooks brought back these vintage recipes to celebrate Southwestern heritage and remind Gen X cooks of their grandparents' resourcefulness. Number 6, liver and potato mash. Liver, once considered cheap and nutrient-rich, became a staple for those who couldn't afford prime cuts. To dilute its strong flavor, resourceful cooks mashed it into boiled potatoes, forming soft patties that were browned in a skillet. This technique also stretched a small piece of liver to feed multiple people. Accounts from the 1930s show that children sometimes objected to the taste, leading mothers to add onions or a dash of vinegar for extra zing. By the 1940s, charity cookbooks shared tips on how to mask the bitterness. Baby boomers who grew up in the 1950s sometimes recalled these patties as a love-it-or-hate-it dinner. In the 1970s, as meat prices rose again, some households returned to organ meats, rediscovering old methods for making them palatable. Number 7. Canned veggie crisp. Forget fancy casseroles. This dish was literally every canned vegetable in the pantry, combined with a basic topping of flour and oil or bits of stale crackers. The technique was to layer peas, carrots, and corn, any brand or leftover, in a baking dish, then sprinkle on a crust. Baked until golden, the vegetables under the crust tasted surprisingly comforting. In 1934, one Detroit newspaper ran a story of a mother feeding her family of 8 using just 2 cans of veggies and a handful of flour scraps for an entire week, rotating whichever spices she had to create different versions. By the 1950s, baby boomers occasionally teased their parents about that veggie crisp, but found themselves cooking it again in the 1970s when budgets got tight, proving nostalgia and thrift go hand in hand. Number 8. Spaghetti tomato fry. This dish arose from the need to repurpose leftover spaghetti, a rare treat for some families. Frying cold, cooked noodles with canned tomatoes, onions, and a small pinch of sugar transformed the noodles into a nearly meaty flavor. Some folks who could spare a bit of ground beef or sausage added it in, but most did without. In 1933, cooking clubs recommended spaghetti tomato fry as a fast dinner option that tasted like a more expensive meal. By the 1960s, the baby boomer generation often recalled watching grandmothers put leftover noodles in a cast iron skillet. In the 1970s, budget cooking classes promoted similar skillet suppers, capitalizing on the popularity of quick solutions and reflecting old memories of big family dinners in old America. Number 9. Oat crust pot pie. Flour shortages made pot pies a challenge, so some families turned to ground oats for the crust. They'd blend them with a little water and any fat they could spare, pressing it into a pie plate as a makeshift shell. Filling it with diced vegetables, turnips, carrots, and potatoes provided a savory meal that gave the illusion of a proper pastry. By 1935, local newspapers in the Midwest championed this approach, calling it a modern solution to wheat shortages. Baby boomers in the 1950s occasionally joked that their moms served oat pies for dinner, but the concept was revived in the 1970s in vegetarian circles, who lauded the high fiber content. Today, glimpses of old commercials featuring oats remind us how these Depression-era tips influenced modern diets. Number 10. Biscuit dough pizza. In an era when yeast wasn't always handy, biscuit dough stepped in as a pizza crust alternative. Families pressed a thin layer of quick dough onto a baking sheet, topped it with tomato paste or sometimes just stewed tomatoes, plus a sprinkle of cheese if available. This approach surfaced in 1931 for families in industrial cities, where flour might be rationed, but baking powder was still accessible. Kids found this fun to assemble, which helped them forget about the limited toppings. By the 1960s, baby boomers recognized biscuit dough pizza as a nostalgic snack. In the 1970s, with the rise of ready-to-bake biscuit tubes, some frugal cooks recalled their grandparents' version, proving that 20th century constraints still had a culinary influence in the modern age. Number 11. Cornflake-coated mystery meat. Believe it or not, cornflakes were not just for breakfast. When meat was limited, families dipped thin slices of cheaper cuts, like pork shoulder or scrap beef, in watered-down, evaporated milk, and then rolled them in crushed cornflakes. This created a crispy exterior without needing expensive breading materials. The recipe thrived in the 1930s, especially in factory towns where cornflake samples were sometimes given out to promote brand loyalty. By the 1950s, baby boomers recognized this crunchy dinner as a once-a-week staple. In the 1970s, new cereal advertising spurred a nostalgic wave, and some people revived the old technique, though ironically, cornflakes were no longer the cheapest option. Still, the memory of turning scraps into a fried treat persisted as a hallmark of American creativity. Number 12. Lentil and rice burgers. Meatless burgers didn't begin in modern health cafes. They came about in the Depression. Families discovered that cooked lentils, mixed with boiled rice and flavored with onion or garlic, could be formed into patties resembling the shape of a burger. Pan frying in a small amount of oil produced a savory crust. By 1937, community gatherings in certain Midwest towns featured these lentil patties as a solution to skyrocketing beef prices. Baby boomers in the 1950s sometimes saw them reappear for Friday suppers, fulfilling religious or dietary restrictions while staying cheap. Then, in the 1970s, vegetarian movements picked up the idea of lentil and rice burgers, ironically returning to old America's thrifty meal out of concern for health and budget, a testament to how nostalgic dishes can circle back in new forms. Number 13. Peanut potato soup. This unusual pairing showed up in the 1930s among families who had peanuts but needed to stretch them further. They'd boil peeled potatoes until soft, mash them in the broth, and stir in a spoonful or two of peanut butter to create a creamy consistency. Sometimes a dash of onion or celery salt was added for extra flavor. Cookbooks from the 1940s highlight peanut potato soup as an example of global inspiration, similar to African peanut stews, though adapted to American pantry realities. Baby boomers in the 1950s occasionally heard older relatives talk about this quirky soup. By the 1970s, food journalists seeking international flair rediscovered it, never realizing it was a Depression hack that let families transform humble staples into exotic-tasting comfort food. Number 14. Mashed bean pie. When beans were abundant, creative home cooks found a way to turn them into savory pies. They mashed cooked beans, pinto, navy, or kidney, mixed them with a few vegetables, and spooned everything into a shallow crust or pastry base. The result was hearty, dense, and high in protein. Accounts from the 1930s mention that families near canneries often received dented cans of beans at reduced cost, inspiring the creation of new dishes like mashed bean pie. Baby boomers in the 1950s might have teased their parents about bean for dinner again, but by the 1970s, rising meat prices saw a spike in bean-based recipes. Mashed bean pie was reintroduced in community cookbooks, reflecting that golden age when people drew on heritage solutions for modern problems. Number 15. Potato carrot stir-fry. This simple skillet meal combined leftover potatoes and diced carrots with minimal seasoning. By frying them in a small amount of fat, home cooks achieved a dish that tasted surprisingly filling with hardly any cost. In diaries from 1933, mothers recounted how they'd hide a sliver of bacon in the pan for added flavor, retrieving it afterward to reuse the grease. By the 1950s, baby boomers remembered that sizzling sound in the kitchen each week. In the 1970s, as interest in vegetarian-friendly recipes grew, some families realized they'd been meatless Monday pioneers, leaning on potato carrot stir-fry from their grandparents' era without ever calling it trendy. Number 16. Bread scrap bake. This dinner took every stale crust, leftover roll, or crumb from the bread box, tore them into pieces, and layered them in a casserole with water or broth, plus any available vegetables. The mixture was then baked until golden on top. The 1930s mindset of waste nothing meant bread was rarely thrown away, and bread scrap bake exemplified that principle. Some families seasoned with salt, pepper, or dried sage, gleaned from local gardens. Baby boomers in the 1950s heard stories of how their grandparents used to stand in long lines for free bread, only to turn it into a hearty dinner. By the 1970s, a few frugal cooking columns revisited this concept, reminding Americans of those thrifty times when stale bread was a prized ingredient. Number 17, cabbage and noodles patch. In immigrant-heavy neighborhoods during the Depression, a single head of cabbage often had to feed an entire family for days. Slicing it thin and mixing it with homemade noodles offered a bulk meal. Boiling the noodles in a stock pot, then adding pan-wilted cabbage, created something close to a hearty pasta dish. Oral histories from 1934 mention local potlucks where families shared tips on how to make noodles without eggs. Baby boomers in the 1950s recalled that pungent cooking smell as a staple of old America's kitchens. By the 1970s, cabbage and noodles recipes surfaced in retro cookbooks, appealing to Gen X looking for cheaper dinner ideas that resonated with the vintage wave of nostalgia sweeping across the country. Number 18, mock sausage patties. Ground meat was a luxury, so resourceful cooks turned to finely chopped oats, flour, onions, and leftover coffee for color. The end product resembled small sausage patties, especially if spiced with sage or pepper. By the mid-1930s, thrifty families promoted these patties in local bulletins, praising their ability to fool the taste buds at breakfast or dinner. Baby boomers in the 1950s might have laughed at the idea of oat sausage, but by the 1970s, as budget tips returned to popularity, some tried the recipe for its high protein and low cost. Mock sausage patties stood as a reminder that many illusions of flavor during the Depression became real solutions that got entire communities through economic hardship. Number 19, stewed apples and biscuits. While fresh fruit was hard to come by, orchard states sometimes had surplus apples sold cheaply or given away. Families stewed apples with sugar, or molasses if sugar was sparse, and then dropped biscuit dough on top to create a dinner more akin to a savory sweet cobbler. In 1932, mothers in upstate New York claimed they could feed 4 hungry kids with just 3 apples and a cup of flour, thanks to this technique. Baby boomers in the 1950s recall it as a comforting meal, bridging dessert and main dish. By the 1970s, as apple orchards turned into tourist attractions, the memory of apple biscuit dinners came back, revealing how such a simple idea could enchant modern families craving oldies-style fare. Number 20, tomato goulash pot. A final Depression staple combined leftover tomatoes, any available pasta, often broken spaghetti, onions, and a spoonful of borrowed grease for flavor. It gained the nickname tomato goulash pot, even though it lacked the traditional Hungarian spices. Oral histories from 1931 mention how a mother in St. Louis stretched a single can of tomatoes by adding water and a dash of salt, producing enough sauce for a large pot of noodles. Baby boomers in the 1950s occasionally heard older relatives compare it to real goulash, though this version cost mere pennies. By the 1970s, as the wave of American nostalgia hit, tomato goulash pot reminded Gen X that 20th century families had found creative ways to make do. Nothing epitomized that spirit more than taking a few pantry staples and transforming them into a hearty dinner, capturing the essence of vintage innovation that defined the Great Depression era.